made for them. We do have some comments that were provided to us remotely or separately from Arlen, who couldn't make it to the meeting. So we'll get plenty of input today. As we get started, I first want to hit the meeting summary from last time, from 2 weeks ago. So does anyone have comments on that or corrections, I should say? Right, hearing none, I'll accept a motion.
Amy moves.
Amy
I'll second.
moves. Thank you, Dale. All right, all those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, I see that everyone online is muted. You can unmute yourself at this point whenever you need to. All right, we've not received any public comments for today's meeting, so we will proceed on to item number 4, which is our primary task. Excuse me, our primary task for today, and that's review and discussion of our adopted guiding principles. We will spend virtually the rest of our time talking about that, and hopefully we can come close to a consensus by the time we're through with our conversations. But before we move into that discussion, I want to just briefly describe kind of the bigger picture of what we'll be doing with respect to applying those guiding principles and goals. So first of all, we know that we'll have a limited budget, probably somewhere between $1.5 and $2 billion. And that includes some projects that are going to be moving into RTA next from the current plan. We know that we have established what the main elements of the plan are currently, and those are multimodal corridors, transit, safety, environmental and economic vitality. And at some level, at some point, the board will give us direction about the budgets for each of those areas. Additionally, this is a voter initiative, and so we have to really focus on what makes a plan, excuse me, that the public is going to support. And when we decide if new goals or guiding principles are appropriate, let's make sure that the overall goals that drive our plan development will meet the public's interest and be supported at the ballot. Yeah, I'd like to hear from everyone around the table today. So as I get input from folks, I may call on you if I haven't heard from you. Feel free though to voice your opinion. As we talk about each of these though, let's make sure that everybody gets a chance to weigh in. And I think that's important so that we can all start to understand what consensus might look like as we try to develop that in a plan. So the first thing today will be to go over the guiding principles and goals and figure out how we got to what we have today. Paki has a brief presentation about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm just going to briefly go over the background of how we got to the current CAC guiding principles. And then Rick Ellis will jump in with some key components and then the discussion will begin. So that's kind of the layout for right now. So just in terms of the background, after 6 months of discussion, the CAC developed and vetted and adopted on January 13th, 2020, the set of guiding principles and goals. And this was done to be used as a tool for developing a draft regional transportation plan. So that was the whole purpose behind that. The TMC members and the Transportation Management Committee, they reviewed those draft goals, and then they later considered alignment with the adopted goals when they developed their respective project lists that they have submitted to you that you'll be reviewing. The RTA board was informed of this information adoption on January 30th of 2020 at that board meeting. And that's how the principles framework came to be. So again, because the principles and goals serve as a tool for the draft plan, and you'll be receiving a lot of broad public feedback prior to the future election, there are two parts that the framework has. The first part is a set of guiding principles, and these are very general statements that reflect very regional priorities, implementation, enhancement, considerations, and alignment with the RTA statutes. So that's the first part of the framework. The second part are the goals. These are 10 goals that are measurable objectives that can be set to meet the respective goals. And these are required by the RTA performance review audits. So the TMC, the Transportation Management Committee, will be working with all of you as CAC members to develop a well-balanced regional plan. And this plan needs to meet the needs and expectations of all the communities served by the RTA taxing district here in Pima County. And as you all know, having a well-defined plan is important, which allows for accountability after the plan's been established. So I'm not going to go over the 6 principles and 10 goals, but I'm just pulling them up because you'll all be able to have that roundtable discussion that the chair mentioned earlier. But basically, the principles involve prioritizing regionally significant transportation needs, identifying an implementation budget and timeline, enhancing regional transportation systems overall efficiency, considering land use, travel patterns, technological advances, and then of course spelling out future maintenance funding commitments. As far as the goals, there are 10 goals that were discussed as possible priorities to have a well-balanced plan. And again, you'll be going through all of these individually, but just in a nutshell, these involve reducing congestion, improving transit, improving conditions of the existing roadways, air quality, access to workplaces, and functionality to key corridors. Now I'm going to hand it over to Rick Ellis, who's going to briefly touch on the key components of these guiding principles. Rick?
Thank you, Paki. It's good to see everybody again. As we were developing this, wanted to kind of add in and add a kind of a development or delivery perspective on that for you to consider as these get used, and kind of just a different frame of mind and how it correlates to the current plan. Some key things on this that are important to remember on there. First and foremost, as Paki said, they did develop from a lot of discussions in there. There were a lot of opinions. There were a lot of perspectives thrown out over several meetings on there. And so these guiding principles are meant to be holistic, all-encompassing, if you will. So they're not rigid in their definition. They are subject to some interpretation, and that's a good thing. As long as we're in alignment as an overall committee and organization on that, then they'll all be heading the same direction, even if somebody's got their individual perspectives that may vary from person to person. That's going to be beneficial. That'll be helpful for the conversation. The next part. Second thing I want to leave you with is the current plan was developed, and you've heard it reflected in the plan you're working on as well. But there were the 4 major elements dealing with vehicular, bike, ped, and transit. So a lot of the goals we're talking about, a lot of the guiding principles, they're not going to apply perfectly to each and every project. There will be the roadway projects, which we've already started the discussion and that I presented on last time. There'll be multiple sub-element projects that may be consisting of just intersection improvements, bikeways, pathways, things like that. They're not going to hit all those goals perfectly. It's important to remember that the overall plan does, though. This is the important part, is that Do we measure all those things? Do we track them? Do we move the needle? Whatever analogy makes the most sense for you, so that the overall plan achieves all these type of things. It's well balanced. It fulfills all those aspects and covers all the different modes of travel that we use to get around in the region. This is the one where the cliche of the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts fully approves, fully makes sense, and again, applies here as we move forward on this. And then last one. The last thought I want to give you with is many of the characteristics or qualities or components that you think about in terms of when it comes to delivery by the jurisdictions, financial responsibility, fiscal responsibilities, environmental stewardship, generally equity or quality and how we interact, work with the neighborhoods, the various residents. All those things are built in. They don't necessarily are spelled out in any kind of plan going forward because jurisdictions have already developed policies, procedures, and established, most importantly, the culture that's built into the organization. So many of those aspects and attributes are already naturally ingrained as any project, individual element, or individual sub-element would move forward on that. Basically, the jurisdictions don't have to be given guidance, direction on how to do the right thing because they've built that into their normal everyday operation modes, means, and methods. So wanted to leave that to you as how this translates into kind of as we move forward, how we apply these and how they would be then viewed from the delivery side. So thank you, Paki.
Great. Thanks, Rick. That's great. So we're ready to jump into the discussion. Right before we do that, I wanted to recognize that those of you who are remote can't really see who all is here in the room. So I'll just let you know which committee members are here besides myself. Carolyn Campbell is here, Dale Calvert, Bruce Wright, and Jamie Colley. And we have staff members, Julie, Rick, and Pocky. And of course, Crystal is helping with the AV. Okay, so we're gonna start talking about the individual guiding principles. So I was thinking we'd just go through these one at a time, get your input on these and see if they still make sense to you, if these are the ones that we should continue going forward with as we move through this and the goals. We'll spend at least half of our remaining time then talking about what may be missing or significant changes that you feel are necessary. Okay. All right, so the first guiding principle is that future RTA plans should prioritize regionally significant transportation needs and focus on regional projects. So this is our regionality statement. Do I have any input on that? Any comments, support, opposition, whatever?
This is Mel Cohen.
Go ahead, Mel.
Understanding the definition of regionally, when you actually have to apply it, that's significantly challenging at times.
Yeah, I think that's probably an understatement. At times we have to decide if regionally just means that it goes, for a significant distance. If it impacts the rest of the community or a significant part of the community. And frankly, with these corridor projects, I think we've looked at major arterials that in many cases traverse more than one of the jurisdictions and sometimes are a number of miles in length. Any other thoughts about that, Carolyn?
So reading this again, that means that non-regionally significant transportation needs will be included? And if not, it should only include regional. Because we've heard about that a lot recently, that we need to have only regional projects in here. So if that's the case, and this is a question really, prioritizing them, or should we only be including regionally significant transportation needs?
Okay, good question. That's for us. Yeah, the answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and let's see how conversation goes about this before we try to guess at that. But I will note that one of Rick's comments that you may have missed was that these principles are open to our interpretation of them. So this is really for us to define. Let's see, I have a comment from Ava.
Yes, hi. So about regional and what that means, does that mean that the project connects areas that need connecting? Does it mean that it adds functionality to a key corridor that may actually affect different areas of the region? Are we using miles, length of miles as a way to prioritize? It's just all these questions that I have about the way we define regional, and we are indeed using that as a prioritization concept.
Well, my personal opinion is you can look at RTA1 and you'll see projects that fit all of those sub definitions that you just mentioned. So I think those will be the questions that we'll be trying to answer for ourselves, and champions of individual projects may very well allow the rest of the committee to see that point of view, to be able to see that while this is not a 10-mile project, it is a specific area or a specific mode that's being enhanced by the project, and therefore it meets this kind of regional test. Moss.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Yeah, I think I agree with, just want to echo what everybody else has been saying so far. Melvin's point about definitions, looking across all the guiding principles and this framework generally, it just lacks definition. And Rick, I have to push back. I understand that, we all are going to bring our perspectives, and there's a lot of value in that, but having a clear starting point for what regionalism means, what accessibility, what mobility, safety, what reducing congestion, what is the concept that we're pushing forward is really important. And I think that overall, we need to be thinking about these terms, what our intent is, and having that broader conversation about what our vision for this collectively as regional representatives. And I also wanted to, sorry to pick on you again, Rick, but another really big missing piece here is equity. And we've talked about it before, but I mean, equity is not naturally ingrained in organizations. Otherwise, systemic racism wouldn't be like a thing. And we just see how systems fail people over and over and over. And so we cannot rely on organizations to do it. City of Tucson is not perfect. City of Miranda or Town of Miranda is not perfect. None of us are perfect. And we need to be really intentional about that. I think there's fortunately, we're not, pioneers in this. There's federal and other state initiatives that we can copy and refer to make sure that we're developing a plan that is intentionally trying to address the inequities of our systems. And that all needs to be baked in our definitions and clear intentions. I'm going to drop into the chat too an example of what this could look like. I think a lot of us might be familiar with Move Tucson, and they did a very extensive community outreach effort throughout the pandemic to understand what mobility needs and what people's priorities were. And they have a strategic vision and guiding principles document that I'm dropping in the chat now. And hopefully that can get separated, dispersed to folks. But one of the way they structure it is they talk about complete streets policy goals first and foremost, but then they also have a statement, a vision statement, and the principles of different terms, what those mean, and what the intention of that is. And I think that what that does is it just really helps everybody focus their vision and understanding when looking at projects and considering different things. What are we really trying to achieve? What's our North Star?
Okay, thanks for that. And there will be, more time a little bit later where we'll really get into those in a little more detail. I have a question from Jamie.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I guess I disagree with you. Just, of course we want it, right? But I think that exceeds the scope of this.
Could somebody repeat that? It was hard to hear.
A little louder.
Oh, a little louder.
Closer to
Is that better now? Can you hear it?
Yes, thank you.
Of course, we want equity throughout everything we do, but I think that as a concept is probably for the RTA board itself, not for this committee. It seems kind of exceeds our scope. From what I understand, we're here to try to figure out what we kind of want and need. We're not technicians. We're not the technical management committee. We're trying to just, we're the heart, right? Not the mind. The technical management committee is the mind. And it just feels like we should be figuring out what our different regions want and to increase regional transportation and go from there. Some of these other things I think are way outside our scope. I disagree with making that one of our core principles.
Okay. Hold on to that thought. I have a couple of comments online also. Amanda? No,
Yeah.
Berkman, sorry.
Yes. No, you're okay. I knew you were talking about me. I actually wanted to say that I agree with what Moss has said, and she has articulated. Did I get muted?
No.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I got a thing on my side that said I was muted by the host. Okay. Anyways, as I was saying that I agree with what Moss is saying. She did a better job articulating than I can. But particularly what I would want to say is that we're talking about mobility and accessibility on here. And what that means to me as a disabled person might mean something different to you all. And I think being able to really have a clear definition of what that means is important. Someone just said that we don't think equity should be on here and that we are about providing the heart and not the details of the technical. But in my perspective, equity is heart. That is part of it and including that. So I just wanted to share that.
Okay, thank you. And as I said, we will dive into those in much more detail here in a bit. And just as a response from my view of perhaps a disagreement about whether certain of these items should be included. Some of them may, at some level, result in us recommending to the board that a policy be developed for some of these different areas that perhaps there's not a universal policy in place for, and perhaps equity is one of those areas. Sean Brown.
Yes, board, thank you. One of my questions I just have about this is in regarding to the data we're using, I don't know, as we get further into this, are we using data provided from the census, for instance, to get an idea of the population density of our what's future projected, to get an idea of what the significant transportation needs might be for Pima County and other data collection. So I'm just throwing out information out there.
I don't know if Rick can help us a little bit with that, but I know that each of the jurisdictions spends a lot of time in developing their population census, that is how much traffic is on individual projects, roadways, what the land use patterns are, what travel patterns are, how many people are using transit or bikes within the region. But as far as an overall region goes, that's really what PAG does, is kind of pull together that data from those other jurisdictions. Sometimes PAG actually provides the service to the individual cities and towns, and they all contribute to kind of a single gathering of that data. But I'm sure there are areas, Sean, where you're depending kind of on the data that the individual jurisdiction has compiled in developing their own needs, and that'll be part of our goal, I guess. Part of our responsibility is to see how sometimes those parochial interests may have farther reaching importance within the region. Okay, Bruce, right.
Yeah, this first one has a lot embedded in it, and I have previously tried to talk about a sort of broader perspective, which may complicate the issue. But that's the concept of key commerce corridors, which is a concept that Arizona Department of Transportation has adopted, looking at the movement of people and goods and services, not only just locally, but through a region and through the state. And I do think we need to take a look at this. I had previously asked to have presentations on the agenda regarding trade and trade impacts, and also to have the state come in and talk to us about these key commerce corridors, because I don't think what we do with transportation can stand isolated from those impacts. For example, I'm on the Arizona-Mexico Commission. We've been briefed about this. Trade through the ports of entry continue to increase. That's going to put increasing demand on our roadways for local suppliers and vendors, but also trade moving through the region. That impacts things such as I-10 and I-19, the possibility of a Sonoran corridor, but it also impacts major workforce areas that are developing. The county has just released a plan for a major manufacturing logistics center next to the fairgrounds. The city of Tucson just approved 2,000 acres of industrial development along I-10. All those things are going to impact transportation in the region. And we have been looking at it from a jurisdictional point of view and the projects they support. I think we need to overlay that broader context and understand what are going to be the broader demands on the system and how that's going to relate to our decision making. And it also relates to the availability of sources of funding from the state and the federal government. So I would hope at some point in time we have that discussion. They may not be specific decisions we have to make, but I think we have to take them into our consideration as we view these projects.
Okay. Dale.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to kind of say me too to what Bruce is saying about commerce corridors, etc. And I'll use the term regional activity centers when you talk about what's regionally significant. I think you go into the idea of how people are trying to get from one significant activity center to another, and I think that's kind of duplicating what Bruce is saying and with different terms. But so that's having said that, I think I want to move back to the concept of trying to define this more. I was and still am to a degree from 2006. I pushed for harder definitions back then, and that was a long time ago now. But as a practical matter, harder definitions, defining a little bit without some latitude in them, really becomes very difficult. As somebody who spent 50 years as a CPA looking at definitions in the Internal Revenue Code, a lot of times you end up, and this is an atrocious concept, but you end up splitting the baby. You write something, and then it's a major issue with the development of the Internal Revenue Code over the years. And that's a major issue why we have so many amendments to the Internal Revenue Code, because you write a lot of definitions, and then 5 years later, you've got a whole constituency arguing to modify those definitions. So there's two sides to this of being a little more strong. I hear what people are saying about equity being an issue, and it needs to be in there. And the last thing I'd like to say is when you want to make it, I think to a certain extent, the two larger jurisdictions have the greatest possibility of having something that's regionally significant that is only in that jurisdiction. So I think we need to avoid jurisdiction. And I'll take, for instance, the proposed Miracle or Oracle Road, South 6, etc. bus rapid transit project. That project is all but for where it goes through South Tucson is all in the city of Tucson. But I think it would also still be very regionally significant, just as an example. So
Okay,
that's number comment.
thank you. Carolyn?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. I wanted to just read a comment from Arlen on the, I think, Mr. Chair, at the beginning, you mentioned that we got some comments, a page of comments from Arlen because he couldn't be here right before the meeting, and perhaps we can get them out to everybody after the meeting. But I just wanted to address that when he has a short paragraph here that says, the existing principles are written based on moving people, and the implication of moving, quote, stuff is hidden only in the phrase economic vitality. Eventually, it seems most of our traffic may be from Amazon and other delivery trucks, let alone destination-based and pass-through tractor trailers, all of which are necessary, likely necessary in a sector that will continue to grow and greatly impact the road system. I think it needs to be evaluated. So that's what he had to say on that particular point.
Okay, good. Thanks. I see we have online a couple of additional comments that both Ava and Moss wanted to make. I would like to make sure that everybody gets a chance to get their word in. So let's go to Karen right now.
I'm wondering what we're doing. Maybe you could speak to what this process is going to look like, because it looks like we're going over the existing principles and then we're bringing up new principles. I mean, can you kind of tell us what the roadmap is going to be that we're traveling here? Because, you know, I mean, I have some suggestions certainly as to how we go about this, but maybe you have something in your mind as to how this process is going to look like, because I don't know, we may be in an argument about certain things that later on aren't even arguments. So hopefully, does that make sense, Mr. Chair?
Yeah, I think it does. The plan we have is to look at the individual current principles and goals, see where we have commonality, where we continue to support those, and then to move into new ones or start doing some wordsmithing if that's necessary. So, well, I appreciate that everyone is jumping in with lots of thoughts about the guiding principles. I do want to try to take these 6. If we could try to limit ourselves here at the beginning to the individual bullet item that is next up, I think it would be good for all of us. Okay, so any other comments about regionality? I think it's clear that if we don't have a common definition of regional, that we're going to need it. So let's take a look and see what other undefined words we can find in our second one here. So a future RTA plan should include an implementation timeline and identify specific projects. Dale.
Yeah, actually, this is one I think is moderately well defined, because we talk about it.
I'm going to be putting a time limit on this. If you don't speak up within 5 seconds, I'm going to consider it good and we'll send it on to the board for ratification.
Anyway, the implement, I think it defines it fairly quickly, should include an implementation timeline, which is basically from the current plan is the 5-year periods and putting all the projects into their 5-year periods. And those of us who've been through this before remember that we had a lot of arguments about that. And identify specific projects, and both of which were things that were really in the original concept, because those were things that had always been argued about development of projects on the side. So, we've got specific projects, identify what a specific project is, and then when it's going to be built is kind of, I think, a very, very basic thing that we need to accomplish as far as this plan.
All right, thanks. Ava?
Yeah, on that note, I just wanted to, place perhaps a placeholder on identifying specific projects at some point. I think we need to have a conversation about how we're going to do that, right? Something I've mentioned in the past that I think would be really helpful is having a weighted tool where we can express all of these considerations that we're talking about right now. I hope somebody's making really good notes. We can break down some of these into categories, subcategories with weights that we all are in somewhat of agreement on, at least. Have we had a process for identifying specific projects in the past, or was all the projects just pretty much able to be moved through? I mean, I understand that this time we're going to have a lot of vetting and calling that's going to have to happen.
Yes and yes. However, what we don't have right now is an actual weighting tool. We do need to identify the weight of the individual items that will go into our decision. And as we've mentioned before, Ava, I hope you'll help us in developing that.
Yeah, I'm taking notes too as we're speaking and as people are bringing up their concerns.
Very good. Moss.
First, I wanted to say, Ava, that sounds, I really, support that idea, and and maybe it's to kind of pin on that, if there's like a subcommittee that needs to get formed for that kind of metric tool. Just want to throw my hat in to support the development of that. And then also to make another plug that Move Tucson has a project prioritization framework already drafted, and that could be a good resource for us as we do that. As far as this bullet point, I agree that I think the terms are pretty clear. The one thing I think that should be added is our categorical funding, right? Because we have the funding that we were going to decide how much goes to specific projects, but then we have the different categories that we will be allocating. So I think that should be included within this bullet point explicitly.
Good. Okay, so did I have another comment here inside? Bruce?
I just had a question, and maybe it's a diversion and you can rule me out of order, Mr. Chair, but I raised this last time. We've received all the roadway projects, but I'm wondering what the process is going to be for bringing forward non-roadway projects, transit, those kinds of things. When is that going to happen, and how is it going to happen? Are the jurisdictions doing that? What is the process for doing that? And what's the timing for it so that it can be integrated into the larger discussion that we're having?
Well, I think the comment just before yours about identifying those categories and finalizing that is the first step before we can actually say how much goes in, and the board can say how much goes into each and what are they really made up of. What are the types of projects that go in there? Do any of them need to be named, or how would we prioritize, or how would the RTA prioritize those projects as they're submitted by the individual jurisdictions?
Could I follow up with just
Yes, of course.
At the last meeting, Ted and Rick and Farhad and all of you talked about a timeline and some deadlines for doing things, and it seems to me that we're on a pretty short time frame here. So I'm just wondering when we're going to solve that issue, because it's a big consideration as part of this whole package.
Okay. Very good. All right. Then Farhad, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chair, if you recall, we briefly discussed at the last meeting, at the August meeting of the board, potentially that would be the first opportunity for the board to be able to provide more direction on those individual elements and the budget. So yes, you're correct. They are discussing it, and we hope to be able to have that information for you soon after.
Bruce, thanks for bringing that up. I two questions there, especially Farhad, with that kind of reminder about the timeline, because I think that the board, is it correct that they gave us until August like 18th to revise our guiding principles? So I guess I'm just concerned about if the board can't provide us direction, how are we supposed to, put forth, make these types of revisions without their guidance?
Sure, Mr. Chair. So that was specific to the budget and the breakdown of the budget. Other than that, as we discussed last time, there are going to be individual policy discussions that the board will direct and bring back to you. So for the purpose of this discussion, I don't think we need to get into the details of the budget just yet. That's something that the board decided that they will provide direction at a later time.
I guess that is another question I had about the budget. My understanding from like our orientation and earlier meetings was that we were going to have the latitude to define how much spending goes into each category. And I think it's a really important part of the citizen advisory committee's kind of job to say that this is how dollars are spent, and that's key to that. Recognizing we're the closest connection to our community members and to the voters and who's ultimately going to pass this. So I guess I'm just trying to clarify how that got removed from our, table.
So let me jump in here if you don't mind. This is always going to be a board responsibility to establish those budgets, the individual budget and the overall budget. However, the CAC is certainly going to have opinions, and I think it's appropriate that if we have an opinion about how much of the money should be set aside for transit, how much should go into other of the areas, other of those buckets, then we certainly, I would encourage the committee to make that known so that we can let the board know this is our opinion about how those buckets should be funded, and see where it goes from there. But again, by policy, that is the board's ultimate responsibility, just as approval of a draft plan is the board's responsibility. But certainly we will be providing, well vetted and discussed and considered plans for them to ratify, hopefully. But again, it'll be their responsibility to do that.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I guess I was just confused too, because my understanding was that the 2006 RTA was the ones that set the percentages. So it just seems like a reversal of the policy from then. So I guess I missed something, and any other insight on when that changed and what the specific policy is certainly helpful.
Yeah.
But I'm appreciative of your note that we can certainly express our opinion. So yeah, thanks for that clarification, Tom.
Mr. Chair, on that point, because that was one of the things I was going to bring up. General Maxwell talked last time about, which I think will be really helpful, having a deadline for the election, or at least a timeline for the election, and then a deadline for us to be getting something to the board, and also the taxing amount, et cetera. And he did bring up, which was the first time I'd heard it, that the board would be looking at giving us percentage amounts. And I recalled afterwards that in our last round, almost 20 years ago, that was the percentages of the different categories was very much an RTA, CAC conversation. And I remember in our transit committee how there was a particular force in the CAC that wanted to make sure it was smaller than such and such amount, and then our transit committee was, but anyway, so I would hope that the board would consider, of course, it's their prerogative, but that which way the numbers flow. I believe that the numbers should flow, the percentage numbers should flow from the CAC to the RTA board, and maybe even the TMC. It'd be a iterative discussion, but that was one of the biggest kind of conversations we were having in that whole CAC process was, how much does each category get or deserve or warrant?
Yeah, that and which of the named projects were we going to
Yes, of
include
course.
in the deal? Patricia?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to sort of add to this conversation and express my concern about the percentages and not knowing, whether or not they're going to come from us or from the board, and also having these kind of different timelines happening all at once, because we've already been presented with, the roadway projects, and we don't have a date for when we're going to receive the other ones. If we aren't able to develop our percentage and give them to the board, our opinion of expressing how much percentage we want for a certain type of project, like what if we don't receive even that dollar amount of projects, like in the projects that we are received to rank and prioritize? Like, I'm just kind of curious how these two processes can happen at the same time and not be in conflict with each other, actually.
Yeah, and I don't know. Sorry. I will say, though, that we are going to have to do these things in series rather than individually complete one and then go to the next and then to the next and to the next. It's going to be a little bit messier than that, but I think that's important. As we're talking about individual projects, we'll also be talking about what goes into the individual categoricals. And as we're doing all of that, we're going to see how we think it should be broken up. That is, how much of it should go for roadways and named projects, and how much should be reserved for whichever categories we think are most important for the plan. So I think as we're working, we'll be back and forth among each of these topics. And I can't imagine a way of doing it otherwise that would be much cleaner than that. But I'm certainly open for those kinds of thoughts. Dale?
I'd like to say a couple things. One is I definitely feel this committee should have at least some significant input on the allocation. And two, just as a matter of history, the RTA board technically did not even exist. We had various government input, et cetera, back when we were working in 2006. But the reality is it's the election that actually technically created the RTA board. So until we had the election, the RTA board didn't exist. There was clearly input from governmental entities, and there was committees and things brought forward. But if somebody can correct me if I'm technically wrong, but I think
I think the PAG board operated as the RTA board.
Yeah, no, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead, Farhan.
Yeah, no, the RTA board was created as a board. The board was the committee that put together the CAC and TMC. So the board was already created previous to the CAC establishment.
Okay.
Thanks. Sean?
Yes, Mr. Board, thank you. Do we by chance have any example of what was done in the past to give us an idea of what we're trying to establish in this process? Because I know we're talking, but do we have an idea of what that plan looks like, a timetable specific projects that are done prior before we got on board to say this is what they've done in the past.
Yeah, and that's kind of how we started this whole process. We looked at how we had done it in the past. As a committee, we evaluated what we needed to do differently and what made sense as far as continuing on. All of that then was weighed against what the law is, that is what the enabling legislation for the RTA would require us to do, and as well looked at those policies that the board had established. So that's what we're dealing with now. So much of what you see about our process now comes from that previous work, but it's a really good point you make about some of that history, kind of how it was done previously, but not necessarily with the thought that that's how it should be done. But to know that some of that history is helpful. And that's one reason we're going through this right now, to show you our new committee, to remind some and to show some for the first time how we got to these guiding principles, and perhaps be able to talk about those again. Farhad, did you have another comment?
Yeah, if I may, good question, Sean. I just want to add that, obviously we have 15 years of history with the implementation of the current plan. And a lot of the things that the board is discussing are really lessons learned. And the audit that we talked about at the last meeting, that's a really good tool for us to demonstrate how we can implement and make sure that the future plan hopefully has some of those policy issues included. So a lot of the questions that are coming up so far, they are definitely, board level discussions that we've been having, and it's all really focusing back on your question on lessons learned and how do we proceed with the next plan. So with that, Mr. Chair, I really want to encourage everybody to maybe to stick on the agenda item a little bit more and make sure that hopefully we can have a more productive conversation about each item. So if I recall, you're on item 3 on the budget, correct?
I think we've beaten the budget to death in my view.
Okay, yeah, so if I may ask that, if we can focus on these, and we'll be happy to answer any questions, but we want to make sure that we stay on the budget, on the agenda, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Bruce.
Well, I think my comment is on the budget. So it seems to me that at this point, the board is not ready to set the tax rate, whether it's a 1/2 cent, 3/4, or 1 cent, or what it might be. So it seems to me that the methodology we come up with has to anticipate that it would fit at a different tax level, because the goal requires us to have an implementation budget that matches projected excise tax revenues. So how we set priorities and the methodology by which we assign percentages to the categories has to then be applicable to a different tax rate and anticipate that. So I think that's a very important part of this consideration. And I think this discussion is relevant to that whole issue.
Sure.
Mr. Chair, if I may clarify that as well. So the assumption in our adopted long-range plan is the existing 1/2 cent and continuing the existing 1/2 cent. If for any reason the board decides to change that, that's really the component of the conversation if they desire any change. But for the purpose of your committee, the 1/2 cent is the assumption.
Okay, let's go to our next item here. The future RTA plan must enhance the regional transportation system's overall efficiency and contribute to mobility, accessibility, safety, economic vitality, and sustainability in the region. The idea being that this be a holistic system and plan. Moss.
Thanks, Tom. I did just want to circle back on the last thing that Farhad just mentioned. And I think it's a feeling that, well, one, I'm really glad that we're having this conversation, but it also took us like 3 months to just get this onto the agenda, even to have a conversation. And now we're having, I think, a productive conversation of identifying gaps, but I'm just feeling the pressure of that timeline that we got from the board, and yet we're all acknowledging major gaps in knowledge. And so it's like, how I guess I'm feeling concerned and kind of frustrated in some sense that we, the CAC, are getting rushed along through doing just good, basic, decent planning practice. And even though there's not a timeline, not even like a project timeline for developing the plan or when any of this is getting, we don't have basic information. You know, to Bruce's point, I just think it was so well stated, Bruce, you know, how we're making these decisions really matters, how much money we're going to have and how much we're making these prioritizations. And I think I'm feeling kind of frustrated that there's lack of infrastructure, lack of guidance, and we're just being told to move. We need to make it to 2024. But we're kind of getting set up to fail is what it seems to me. And so I want to first say that and kind of let that sit for a moment, and then be happy to kind of shift back into the conversation about the guiding principles. And I also have some ideas about, I think Karen was kind of nodding at this earlier, that there might be a more effective way to approach this discussion. And I think we owe it to our region and to our neighbors to do that, you know.
Okay, any other comments?
Mr. Chair.
Carolyn?
I'm not sure if this is again from Arlen, and I'm not sure if, I mean, it seems like this would be a place to say it. He says, I was comfortable with the guiding principles we had reached previously, although probably like most of us, I might have done them differently left to my own devices. I think we should find a way to include something on climate change, transportation technology advancements, freight needs, and equity of service within the goals and principles. I do not think that every individual project should be evaluated in this context, as these are overarching system goals. So instead, I think we should look at the system as a whole to decide whether or not for climate change and equity of service mobility, the plan as a whole enhances, is neutral, or compounds problems existing in the current system and region. I mean, he goes on in that sense, but I don't know if that, I mean, we're not talking about adding language to this about enhance the regional transportation system, you know, what this bullet is, but I just wanted to talk about, or at least read his comments as we're moving through it. And because I think what he's saying is kind of like, he doesn't think that anything individual projects shouldn't be trying to address all of them at any time, but it's kind of the sum of the whole, or the whatever Rick was talking about earlier. But I just wanted to put that, I mean, he has a very long email, so I don't want to read it all here, but that seemed to be.
Well, it sounds a lot like what Rick had talked about earlier, in that individual projects weighed against each other are not necessarily going to be a good way of us determining what the highest priority of a project is, simply because they're very different. You know, they may be a big corridor improvement or reconstruction, and another may be, you know, a new bicycle and pedestrian way that's created. They may be much different in terms of budget, in terms of scope and everything else, yet they could have nearly identical priorities within our plan. So I think that's pretty clear that we'll need to look at these projects as an entire plan and understand that parts may seem not to be exactly equivalent among the different types of projects that we see. Okay, let's go to the next one. Should consider future land use, travel patterns, mode choices, and technological advances. Ava,
I'm not ready to go on to the next one because actually I have comments about overall efficiency. I have comments about contributing to mobility, about accessibility, about safety, about economic vitality and sustainability. Each of those I see as a separate category that have a number of questions that can help unpack the evaluation. So, I mean, for example, just to take the first, right? Systems overall efficiency. I mean, to me, that's a question of, is the system serving all of our residents in an efficient way? And that includes people who may not be able to drive, right? That includes people who are moving themselves around in different manners. So what does that mean, right? Overall efficiency of moving people, right? And we also talked about moving people. Are we talking about moving people? Are we talking about moving things? I'm not really interested in advocating for Amazon as a citizens advisory committee, but anyway, contributing also to accessibility, right? We know that accessibility involves a number of considerations, right? How do people of limited incomes get around? How do people of diverse abilities, including children and the elderly, get around? Do we improve options for people without access to a car, right? What kind of universal design standards for sidewalks, protected bike paths, and protected intersections are there? So those are all things that would be consideration in unpacking and deciding what contributes to transportation accessibility.
So,
also, I just wanted to state in terms of
sorry, I just wanted to ask a question about that. Do you feel that that's not being described in this principle?
I think it's not. There are too many ways in which it could be read that are ambiguous. So I do think that it would be important to, this is how I have them in my notes, right? Each one of these unpacked a little bit with some questions that would apply to how we would evaluate the project and whether it is really meeting this goal, right? Safety, for example, does it reduce or keep speed at safe rates, right? Does it reduce likelihood of crashes for pedestrians? Does it reduce likelihood of crashes for cyclists? Does it reduce likelihood of crashes for motorized vehicles? Those are all separate considerations. Does it include traffic calming design, right? For me, those are all separate considerations. You have to look at it from different angles, depending on whose safety you're talking about. And I also just want to go on record as saying that I believe that safety needs to be the highest weighted category of all, definitely.
So I appreciate those comments. I think, though, that you're really getting into the goals. These are general principles that we want to have on board as guiding us. But knowing how we measure those or how we know that we're successful is in the unpacking that you described. And I think as we look at the individual goals then that go along with these guiding principles, that may be the place where you can actually do that unpacking. I can't even imagine developing, unless this is what everyone thinks we should be doing, but developing guiding principles for each of these system components as a separate guiding principle seems really messy to me. Sorry,
that makes sense. That makes sense. Actually, that makes total sense to me. You know, I don't have a problem, for example, with any of these, but I would want to make sure that we've had a conversation about what they mean, right?
Yep, absolutely. Carolyn, go ahead.
I just wonder, with listening to Ava, I wonder if we should make the mobility accessible, safety, et cetera, also must enhance. So it's at least equal with the system's overall efficiency. So must enhance the regional transportation system overall efficiency and enhance mobility, accessibility, safety, economic vitality, and sustainability in the region instead of just contribute to it. I don't know, Eva, if that really addresses what you're talking about, because I agree with Tom that, you know, that and the goals, and as we go through the projects, I think that we can prioritize things individually. based
Right.
on- Yeah.
I mean, if I were just, thank you for that clarification. If I were writing this, I would put must enhance safety first, and then I would be, you know, when I would rewrite this in a way where we're really weighting it appropriately, weighting the different considerations appropriately.
You mean in the correct order or?
Right, in the order that I would want to see the weight placed, right? So safety would be the first enhancement, even before overall efficiency, because we obviously have made sacrifices, safety sacrifices in the name of quote unquote overall efficiency. So I would want to see must enhance safety before all these other things that are on this list.
Thank you. All right, let's try to get down into this last one here then, or see, where are we?
Second to last.
Second to last. We should consider future land use, travel patterns, mode choices, and technological advances.
Mr.
We'll
Chair, go ahead.
I was just going to say on the last one, I think really key things that are missing here is like must address, frankly, or maybe this could be another principle, must address environmental injustices and work towards making a more environmentally just, you know, region. And I think that ties in with equity. And then also within that, adding something about also must mitigate climate change impacts. I think these are like really basic things, and you know, given the context of our world, and we should be including that in those plans, and even having a statement such as that would be important for these principles.
Okay, yeah, we'll get to that, and hopefully at that point we'll continue to talk about definitions of each of those, and what kind of goals we could attach to them as well. Okay, let's say must spell out future maintenance funding
Sorry,
commitments.
Mr. Chair, I just had another comment written from Arlen on the should consider future land use. He just says, the fifth principle in our approved framework of should consider future land use, travel patterns, mode choices, and technological advances is weak. I have felt that from the beginning, and maybe consider should be replaced or augmented by should be evaluated in the context or similar language. So I don't know what to do with that, but don't shoot the messenger. That's from Arlen. Thank you.
Okay, good. All right. Any other comments on number 5? All right. Must spell out future maintenance funding commitments secured from each responsible jurisdiction in the taxing district prior to plan approval. This one, when we developed it, was acknowledging that clearly the most important aspect of our transportation system to the general public for the past number of years has been maintenance. That is the condition of the existing roadways. And as a committee, we felt, and I think probably still feel, that without confirming that that basic tenet to the public, that we will not get much traction and certainly not much support from the voting public. And there have been a number of maintenance projects or maintenance programs developed, particularly by the city and the county, that speak to that. And we know that when we talk about this as a committee, one of the things we'll be discussing is whether maintenance is needed in all the areas of the community, whether it should be only for RTA projects, whether it should only be for the new ones. There are a number of things to talk about, but the point is that it's a guiding principle that we need to include in our principles as we develop a plan. Dale.
I think when we talk about this, I think we have to, at least from a historical standpoint, comment on the fact that historically RTA did not fund maintenance. Maintenance was a jurisdictional responsibility. And I think there's a lot of desire to reevaluate that. As someone who's really lived with the maintenance problem on the bond and sales tax oversight committees, I have been obviously talking about Proposition 411 from the city standpoint. I think it needs to stay here in some form, and it needs to be an active decision as to what's going to transpire. I know from just listening to city council meetings that the city of Tucson had, basically when they adopted 411, they came up with maintenance, a much more active maintenance program for residential or neighborhood streets is the correct terminology they're using, versus collectors, and that they haven't spelled out anything to this point long term on maintenance regarding arterials, and that they're awaiting what happens out of this process to deal with that arterial maintenance issue. I think that there needs to be discussion, and I think this item definitely needs to be considered.
Yeah, and we will need significant additional input from the TMC, I think, as we take up that issue.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go to the next item and start talking about those. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep looking away and hands go up. Kevin Thornton.
Hey, Tom, the last bullet there about future maintenance, I'm not sure it's clear on this one what we mean. In other words, are we talking about providing funding in the 20-year plan for maintenance? And then if we're saying that the projects must be maintained after that period, I mean, it's only a limited amount, it's a 20-year period, so the funding will go away. So what's the plan beyond that? Or are we just saying that the jurisdictions must provide some sort of commitment into the future that they're going to maintain these projects? Because that's kind of how it is worded. How I'm reading it as it's worded now is that we're saying that each jurisdiction, that any RTA project that's included in the plan, each jurisdiction's basically saying they must provide a funding commitment for that project. So I guess I'm wondering on the wording on that one and what the intent is.
Yeah, as I recall, and others of you who were participating in that conversation at the beginning can jump in, but we talked about at the very least having to demonstrate to the voting public that the jurisdictions have their acts together as far as maintenance funding goes. And if it includes reliance at some level on the RTA, then that needs to be very well defined, whether it's, as I said before, if it's just for the new projects coming up, and then what about beyond their 20-year life, let's say, do we have the commitment from those individual jurisdictions, as well as looking at current progress, let's say, toward improving street conditions. So 411 is an example. The county's PAYGO program, others that have allowed them to evaluate and show to the public that over the past several years, improvements have been made. There are commitments, including financial and political, to continuing that process, and that into the future, the voters can rely on RTA's either plan or the jurisdictions that it represents taking care of their maintenance issues. That's my memory and my evaluation of the conversation we've had about it.
The only thing I would add to that would be that in their initial request from the municipalities, they all, with the exception of Marana, had indicated the desire to seek RTA funding for maintenance, if I remember correctly, and those initial requests. And so there's some desire by at least some of the jurisdictions to get some RTA commitment as to what's done. So,
right.
And I think by that we need to be discussing about it, and the board needs to be discussing.
All right, let's talk about the goals that have been established, and you saw those earlier. Maybe Crystal can advance the slide for us. All right, so we had established priorities that would, or goals, if you will, that would satisfy those general principles that were indicated in the guidelines. So those were as a way of evaluating whether we were being successful. We would say, does a project reduce congestion? Does it provide efficient crosstown mobility? Or does it improve transit ridership? Or does it reduce crashes at intersections? Does it reduce wildlife related crashes? Does it improve the condition of existing roadways? Provide safer bike and ped facilities? Maintain or improve air quality? Improve access to workplaces? Add functionality to key corridors? Let me just ask a question of everyone. Do you see any on here that you object to? I think there are a number that need to be added based on the conversation that I've been hearing this morning. But I have to ask the question, do any of these need to be removed?
Maybe not removed, but I think Tom Bush in an earlier meeting noted that provide efficient crosstown mobility should maybe be reframed to being more regional, have a more regional verbiage.
Yeah, yep, you're right. Just a reminder that we've kind of defined these goals as measurable objectives that can be set to meet the respective goals required by RTA performance review audits. So perhaps Farhad or Rick can remind us real briefly about those audits and what types of metrics, I guess, are expected as a result of those audits that perhaps had not been evaluated before.
So, Mr. Chair, that's probably a more extensive conversation. We'll be happy to do that. But just for everybody's benefit, we have reviewed these goals with the audit team as well. And as part of our conversations, what they do, really, they go back and look at the long-range plan. They look at the Rmap, look at the goals and objectives in the Rmap. And obviously, as you recall, when the CAC was developing these goals, they were consistent with the Rmap as well. So the Rmap is your tool, even for the audit team, to make sure that the region is meeting those performance measure goals. And happy to report that as we discussed last time, they did not have any recommendations or any findings on us not being able to continue to work towards our goals as a region. So those goals are all trending in most cases in the right direction. And in some cases, if they're not, that is our goal to be able to address those moving into the future.
Yeah, and for those of you who haven't seen this, I think I'd like to get these goals out to from the 2045 Rmap update, which is from about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, but I think is probably still the most current for the regional, or for the Rmap. It included topics like maintenance, safety, multimodal choices, performance, environmental stewardship, land use and transportation, freight and economic growth, public involvement, advanced technologies, funding and implementation, and accountability. And I think, as Farhad is saying, these items are largely contained within our goals and our guiding principles, but it may be worth looking at whether some of these may combine a couple of these other RMAP goals as well. Okay, Dale and then Ava.
Just could we get those sent out to us before the next meeting?
Yeah.
So that we can kind of correlate the two, because I think working the two against each other would be helpful.
Yep, definitely. Okay, Ava.
I don't know if it's too soon for this, but I basically see that most of these goals fall pretty nicely under existing priorities, but I do see the potential for maybe 3 or 4 priorities that we don't currently have in our list. I'm not sure if now would be the time to introduce them or if you want me to wait.
Yeah, we're going to be moving into that anyway, so go ahead and let's hear those.
So a consideration that I've seen elsewhere is, do these projects contribute to health through active transportation choices? That is about, can people activate their bodies to get around, right? And does it consider the safety and quality of experience of people using active transport? Another category I've heard people talking about it today is the mobility justice priority. To me, mobility justice is simply falls under efficient system for all. Whenever you talk about all, an efficient system that needs to operate efficiently for all residents, and that is when looking at underserved population comes in. So I don't really even see that as separate to mobility justice. I see mobility justice as something that is a consideration or a lens for all of the different priorities, but I wanted to put that out there. And the one that is really wholly not present, that I think merits a larger conversation is, do these projects contribute to livability, right? Because I think that we don't take those considerations into account as much as maybe could in terms of, these more soft considerations like, does this project increase or decrease scenic beauty, right? Are we, is a view of the Catalina going to be no longer because of the way we build around here? Is it going to increase or decrease a sense of community, right? Is it going to create some sort of a barrier through a community that's going to divide the community in terms of a neighborhood or an area? Is it going to increase or decrease shade and vegetation, which is also a sustainability factor? I think there's, a lot of these factors or goals are, as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, they're intersectional, so they will fall under a couple different priority categories. Shade and vegetation can be a livability issue, but it's also a a sustainability issue in terms of the heat island effect and the climate crisis. Increasing noise pollution also, I believe, is something that needs to be taken into consideration. We know that people who live within certain different distances of major highways, interstates, et cetera, have also inequitable health outcomes. So that needs to be considered under livability or sustainability. Connections to parks, outdoor recreation, arts and culture corridors, right? That could be also under, economic vitality, but not necessarily, right? When we're talking about people just having a good life, being able to access a park, that's not necessarily making anybody money, but it does increase the attractiveness of living in our region. Does it create new pedestrian malls or hybrid use spaces, streeteries, et cetera? Those are all kind of like most cutting edge consideration when it comes to livability, making communities really attractive. Does it decrease the stress of the transportation experience, right? Just the stress of how one gets around is a livability consideration. And then also, does it integrate with water harvesting, solar power, or other green infrastructures? That's something we could look at under the sustainability priority, but it also is definitely something that is really highly related to livability, right? In our desert, it is a challenge to keep vegetation alive. Water harvesting is a super important way of mitigating flooding in our streets as well. Solar power can also provide shade at bus stops, et cetera. There's all kinds of green infrastructure that we could take under both the sustainability and the livability priority categories. So I do think that livability is something that is missing. Health through active transportation, the choices also is missing. And we could say that mobility justice as a priority might be missing. Like I said, I kind of prefer to look at that as a lens through which we analyze everything.
Terrific, thank you. Let's see, Bruce.
Yeah, I'd just like to support the last comment. I think adding and improving regional livability is a really important issue. In anticipation of this meeting, I went back and looked at a number of successful cities that have used transportation to improve the quality of communities. You look at the smart cities principles or complete streets or the new urbanism, all of them understand that transportation has a huge impact on the quality of the community. And I think adding this notion of livability, and as has been presented, there are a lot of elements to it, but I think that would capture the spirit of what we're trying to propose here.
Very good. Let's see, Brian. And then Moss.
Yes, Mr. Chair, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you loud and clear.
Thank you. So I have a question on some of that, though. I look at this a little differently, where I see a lot of the things being discussed within these CAC goals, as far as capturing all the different types of transportation. So by increasing or improving walkways or bikeways, we're allowing for more opportunity or better opportunity for people to choose other modes of travel should they choose. By reducing congestion, we are reducing idle time at stoplights and allowing people to get to their destination quicker with less stress, less frustration, but also less of just the idle emission congestion that goes into the air. Efficient crosstown mobility. You know, we've talked about this for a couple of years when we talk about, you know, lifestyle, where because of congestion, because our roadways are outdated and there's more traffic demand than the roadways can handle, creates an awful lot of frustration for many individuals to just sit there and take longer to get to their destination. Reducing wildlife related crashes we've seen, especially up off Oracle Road, where you don't completely disrupt the native landscape, but you work with it to ensure that you leave those open spaces in those areas for wildlife to cross, but it leaves a bunch of the natural vegetation in place. But I guess my ultimate question here is, my understanding of this, and Mr. Chair, I'd like a little direction here, is we did not choose these projects that have been brought before the CAC. The local jurisdictions made those choices. The elected officials and those employed by these different jurisdictions, they are bringing us the projects that they feel being of value. You know, if I don't live in one of those jurisdictions, I don't have a say in voting for the politicians that live in those jurisdictions. I don't have the authority to override them. So my understanding of this committee has been to take the projects being brought forth by the local jurisdictions and to evaluate them based on something that meets those goals of regional transportation improvements across all modes of travel, and which ones are most efficient and effective, or we believe would be the most efficient and effective, that would gain the support of the voters who ultimately have to pass this. So I don't know, frankly, personally, I don't know how much say we have to dictate to some of these local jurisdictions to deviate from what they proposed. So I'd just like to bring that to you and to the floor. Thank you for the time.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. Just to clarify, when we requested, the CAC requested the individual jurisdictions to provide their projects, their preferred highest priority projects, we asked them to do it looking at our guiding principles and our goals, and to give us projects that met those goals, and we're advancing those guiding principles. So to a great extent, the projects that we've received have been evaluated using that lens. If we add significant issues to this, such as that perhaps they don't believe are already somehow incorporated into our goals, such as livability as an example, then I think it's reasonable to ask the jurisdictions to confirm again those projects. Say, yes, these are projects that meet your goals, and you know, we support them as RTA plan components. Does that make sense, Brian?
It does, sir. Thank you.
Moss.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Brian. I have a couple thoughts to kind of add on to that. And I think that what came to mind is frankly that the part of the issues that we're not actively engaging the public throughout this process as far as informing and vetting these guiding principles. And so that's really never meaningfully been done. And given the time that's passed since these were originally created, I think that kind of further compounds that our regional needs have changed. And so like not having this public outreach actually embedded in our plan development process, I think is a big gap, and why that could be a point of tension. I also think something that I was hearing you getting at, and I appreciate, or, you know, I've said before, is I think that this within here, there's also really unclear definitions. I agree with a lot of the things that you were saying about, like, well, if we do improve crosstown mobility, it can have these benefits for air quality, but there could also be, increased crosstown mobility, and that leads to induced demand, and then that actually increases greenhouse gas emissions and negatively impacts our air quality. And so this is like where I'm going back to, we really need to clearly define what these terms mean and what the intent is. And I'm sorry, I forgot the person's name who said they were a CPA and concerns about too strong of definitions. And I respect that. That's why I think that intent, like what is the intent of these? What do we hope to see from this, is a good way to wayfind us through these topics. And then the last thing in response to that, I think this is also why it's so important for us to talk about the categorical funding and what those priorities are, so that we are not just locked into throwing all $2 billion at named projects that may not actually fit the regional goals and like our regional goals and priorities that we develop together. And, because sometimes they're not going to work. I was looking through that project list, and sometimes I'm also like, where's the evidence that this is going to reduce congestion? What study is this referencing? How is the jurisdiction proving that? Because as far as I understand how this process went, the jurisdiction should just tick a box and say that this project satisfies this priority, but nothing to actually back it up. And I do think that if we have that question, we should and need to have that information available to us to understand why and how jurisdictions are making their decisions or how they put forward these projects.
Great
That is
questions for us to work with the TMC regarding, make sure
And
that we understand where they're coming from in putting forward those projects.
And then just a couple other things added here, or another revisions. I guess I'm curious, what was the rationale behind reducing crashes only at intersections? I think I saw somewhere in Move Tucson that there's actually a lot more crashes that happen along, like outside of intersections on the roadway. And so I think it should just be reducing crashes generally. I also think that we should revise the maintain or improve air quality to just improve air quality. We can't just continue to maintain this if we know it's not excellent. If it's not already, I get PAG, air quality warnings all the time in my email. So I think we should be actively trying to improve it. And rather than provide these are things like, it's just like we need to suss these out a bit more. And I don't know. I know we're running out of time, Tom. So I'm hoping we can continue this conversation.
Yep, we need to get these settled. Just one thing, I think vehicular crashes do occur more frequently at intersections in general, but you brought up the pedestrian and bicycle safety issues, and we certainly see, and I just saw a chat, sorry, I forgot, may have put that in, maybe Ava, that that pedestrians are being struck and killed outside of intersection areas, and that's quite true. So those are all issues we need to deal with. Let's see, we have Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Yeah, first of all, I agree with you on the crashes. I think they do occur most at the intersections, but I suspect that a lot of the pedestrian fatalities in Tucson are away from intersections. So it's something we'd have to look at both. So I would agree with maybe rewording that one for sure. I mean, driving down First Avenue at dusk or just after is kind of scary at times. You look ahead and you'll see, was that a shadow that I just saw? So yeah, that's definitely an issue. And I do like the other goals that we've been talking about, either modifying the goals or adding new ones. One thing I wanted to mention, Tom, that you brought up just before, I think Moss's comment, was getting confirmation from jurisdictions. I think that'd be important on their submitted projects. I think that'd be important regardless of, even if we didn't change anything. I think that would be important just because it's been 2 years in the pandemic since the original submittals were made. So I think that would be important to get confirmation from jurisdictions.
Yeah, and actually, John Bernal is on. I think, John, my understanding is that the TMC is actively doing that or has that on its agenda to confirm those projects with the individual jurisdictions, as well as to have them start trying to prioritize those projects.
Mr. Chairman, yes, that's correct. We of course do have the entire list from all the jurisdictions, and it's been distributed to all the TMC members, and the process you just outlined is what's underway.
Very good, thank you. Ava? Oh, I'm sorry, listen, there's a couple of folks that have been waiting. Carolyn is one, and Dale. Ava, we'll get back to you in a second.
Sure.
Yep, thank you. And this will be quick because I was going to bring something up that Moss brought up at the end of her last statement, but I had brought this up before when we were putting these together, and I still agree that these are goals. We shouldn't have a goal to maintain air quality. We should definitely have a goal to improve air quality, as I've seen so many alerts since we've done this on air quality here. So we should take out maintain or.
Dale.
I'll make a couple comments on the provide safer bicycle and pedestrian facilities. I think needs to have a little more definition as to what our testing standard, what we're reaching for. Because yes, as has been already commented, we had a lot of pedestrians killed. We're also having a lot of bicyclists killed.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to say, and this is kind of changing comment, as we need to keep in mind that we have to direct as what we're going to get the voters to support here, and that there's a broad spectrum of what people are going to be looking for across the county. And they're definitely somebody who's been to meetings in the other jurisdictions. I live in the city of Tucson. You know, there's a whole lot, there's a lot of difference even within the city of Tucson when you're talking about east side versus the center part of the city, about what those people's goals would be. And we need to keep in mind our alignment and our need to try to get a passable bond pack or package here. And you know, I have sat on CACs that involved major center city roads, Broadway and Grant, and I've dealt with Far East Side and that. And yeah, there's a lot of difference about the population and what people are looking for. And that's not that we have to kowtow to that, but at the same time, we need to keep those things in mind, that there are differences out there. And our ultimate goal is to get 50+1 vote to pass this.
Thank you.
And so we need to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thanks. I have a question, Crystal. I see we have an attendee with a hand up and a participant, but my screen just shows Debbie, who I think is a panelist. Can you help me with that? Okay. All right. I have Ava and then Debbie.
Thank you. I just wanted to address some of the procedural concerns that I'm hearing. I believe that it would be interesting for us to consider having the jurisdiction's ranking of priorities be one of the things that we weight. This will help us, right, to adjust our scoring tool so that each jurisdiction is their priorities and which projects they have already deemed are the most important get a special kind of weight. I think that will help us too in terms of balancing out, specificities in projects. I also think that one of the ways we could do this is we could all, use this scoring tool, fill in kind of what we think the score is based on our opinion of each project. What we would be going about scoring them by chunks, probably by jurisdictions. And then we could come together and discuss the ranking as it comes out. That's typically how I've engaged in this kind of usage of this kind of tool in the past, is that each kind of panelist scores, and then we come together for a fuller conversation about how the scoring ended up to see if we think it really reflects all of the factors. So there's more than just a numerical weigh-in. There's also a conversation that goes with that numerical weight that really helps us to maybe even adjust our scores after we've done our first scoring to include considerations that maybe we weren't privy to when we did our first scoring. So my point is to say that there are procedures that we can incorporate that will attend to some of the concerns that I'm hearing committee members voicing.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate that. Debbie.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Did I click on the wrong thing? I apologize when I found that. Anyway,
Excuse me, Debbie, having a hard time understanding your audio there. Could you try again, perhaps a little bit closer to your mic?
oh, okay. Is it better?
No, not really. It's a little clearer, but it's very faint.
Is that better?
Go ahead with that, and we'll listen carefully and try to add that to what other people who may not have heard it can consider.
Okay. Well, thank you. I just have a concern about the idea that just because I live in North Midtown, that I'm not able to make a suggestion about something, about protecting pedestrians and cyclists in Vail. And then also I have a concern about the idea that there's something mentioned about voters and voting, and that we are here to look for the safety of non-voters, in particular children and people just who use don't have that. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Debbie. I'm afraid that most of us missed too much of what you were saying. Would you mind putting some of that into the chat? You had a couple of different points. Maybe have a separate chat input for each of those, and then perhaps we can circle back on that. But thanks for that effort. All right, Crystal, I don't know whose hands are up at this point. Have Moss.
Thanks, Chair McGovern. Sorry, I've been toggling between calling you Tom. Just a little more comfortable. I just kind of recognizing we have 8 minutes left in this call, and again, really appreciative to have this time to discuss these topics. I am thinking, though, I think to what Ava was also getting at, like, what are the procedure, like, how do we move forward from here, and how do we take the feedback, take our different ideas, and clearly it sounds like this group recognizes that the presently adopted guideline or framework needs revisions, and so I want to propose that we start to shift towards that, what that conversation looks like over the next couple of meetings, and I can make a motion if that feels right to use additional meeting time in upcoming meeting time to continue to have this conversation. And I think one thing I think that would be really helpful too is I did some research trying to pull together, like, identify other regional transportation plans that have already done a lot of this work, and I would be happy to share those resources. And I think something that could be really helpful is this group reviewed some of those and came to the next meeting with specific verbiage. I think some people had that today, but just collectively of, like, I like this goal, I like this principle, and then we can bring that together and then have a conversation where we're doing that. And just as there's a way to kind of collaborate and draw upon information, just so that we really kind of nail these down in an efficient way.
Yeah, great minds think alike. Well, great is a relative term, at least in my case.
Both of us.
I'm going to ask before our next meeting, and by the way, right now our next scheduled meeting would be the third Monday in July, because the first Monday is the 4th of July. It'd be a holiday, and we wouldn't meet that day. Plus, I think it gives us time to do a couple of things that you've mentioned that I have intention for. First is to ask staff to please pull together the comments that we've received together today and attempt to put those within the areas that is either the guideline or the goal that they were presented for. So if there are some that are outside of that, like the three that Ava suggested, those would show up as new possible priorities or new guidelines. But this is homework for all of us that we really badly need to do over the next 4 weeks or so, the next month. And that is to review that information, remember those conversations, and decide where you stand on it. But almost as importantly to me is to start the word crafting, if you will. So suggested changes, let's say a change was suggested to further define regional rather than simply allow that word to continue, but to have a parenthetical definition of it or not. If you do think it should, then suggest some wording for it and how you would like to see it worded, so that we have perhaps we'll have some competing ideas about how that should be done. But I'll tell you that when we first did these guidelines and goals, there was a tremendous amount of wordsmithing done, and we recognized that we could go for years, I guess, before we got it done. And so, as a group, we tried to be mature and decide that we would make it as good as we could do, but not take forever to do it. So we want to try to do that again. And then the next time we meet, our intention would be to review those suggested changes that people have described, or clarifications or eliminations, drive through those individually to see if we can reach some conclusions and consensus about those. And then, if possible, complete that process at our next meeting. But that'll require that homework I talked about. And some of what Moss has suggested in her last comment could be part of that homework, to review kind of how other groups, other jurisdictions have approached some of these issues, to understand a little bit more about some of them that we have maybe not considered yet. But in general, collect what information we can, put it together on our own, and then come prepared to share that information and to finalize these goals and objectives so that we can move forward. Mel has his hand up.
Yeah, I would ask that whether it's Moss or others have information that they want to share, could that be shared with the rest of us before the meeting? So we can all look at what other places are doing.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't describe my preference very well there, Mel. My goal would be for that information to be provided within the next week to staff, so that it could be distributed to the rest of the group, so that we actually have some time to use it in conducting this homework assignment.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Well, Pucky, tell me if this is feasible. And I'm thinking because there are people that aren't here today that might be here next time, so they aren't getting the homework. And then there are possibly people that are here providing homework, but they might not be able to be here next time. If you could send out the homework, like reminder, or perhaps just, can everybody do this homework? And I don't want to have too much included in there because that's going to be in the, I don't know if it'll be in the meeting minutes or not, but you know, with Arlen, he sent me these comments about an hour before our meeting, and that's not ideal to be reading his comments out loud. But you know, I think everybody here is probably ready for some homework, but there's hopefully people that would like to join in and however best you can do that. And one other thing, while I have the floor, I tried to log on while I was here because I can't see any chat. I see on our screen there's a bunch of chat. Is there any way we're going to be able to see that chat, or how?
Yeah, all we have to do is ask for Crystal, or
Okay.
I don't know if Taki has she's just advancing. Ask for Crystal to pop up the chats for us all to read, or for me to read out loud. That's why I asked Debbie to
I'll put it in the
try
chat.
to do it.
Right, but
There you go.
and I think that somebody, maybe Moss, had put in a link to a report, like what Dale was asking for, and I like to copy those and, you know, get them for later, but because I'm not going to read it.
Yeah.
A link right now. So anyway, I just don't know how
Okay.
technology works to be able to make sure
Thanks.
that they don't know that we saw them.
Yeah, and for your first request, Taki and I will work on a memo to the rest of the committee,
Thank you.
laying out what those items are that we want people to do before the next meeting, and to provide as much kind of this background information as possible. So we'll try to get that memo out as soon as possible, but my guess is that we'll probably be sending stuff to you over the next 2 weeks, let's say, a few times. Right, Ava.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I think I understood some of what Debbie was saying at the last part of her comment, which was really related to our language about who we're serving. I think this committee used the word citizens. Sometimes we use the word voters. I prefer to use the word residents because these are projects that are going to impact all the residents of the region, regardless of whether they are citizens or voters. And I think that's a really important consideration for us to have in mind as we go about evaluating these priorities and goals.
Yep, you're absolutely right. And then the political reality is that the people who vote on it will decide for the rest of the residents what, if anything, will be done. So it is a balancing act to some extent, but we shouldn't be entering this without the intent of improving conditions for all the residents of Pima County. All right. Last, I'm going to move on and prepare to close the meeting based on what we've just talked about. But I would like to see if we've got a couple minutes. Are there future agenda items that we haven't captured? Okay, as always, you know, you can provide those items directly to me or to Paki, and we will certainly keep those in mind as we craft our what we can get done in a single meeting, and when's the best time that we can get those in front of everyone.
Hey, Tom.
I'm sorry.
Just, I kind of want to make a quick plug again for, I know it's on the running list of agenda items, but to talk about the scheduled time for this call, if we could just allocate 5-10 minutes, have a meeting poll about when, if this is a good time for our group to meet, and maybe some alternative times, even if it's, 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. or something like that, just to accommodate working people. I've had a standing management meeting that I have to skip all the time for this and take vacation time for this. And it's hard. And especially if we're going to be meeting twice monthly to get this moving, it's hard to be meeting in the middle of the day for this. And so I really appreciate that agenda item getting elevated, and just trying to look at a way to accommodate the community members that are on here.
Very good. Thank you for that. All right. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make motion to adjourn.
Dale?
second.
Second. All those in favor, say aye.
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 We are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.